Let the words of my mouth and the meditation of our hearts be always acceptable in thy sight, O Lord, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. Amen. Please be seated. At the beginning of Advent, I made sure to remind all of us that it's not Christmas till it's Christmas. Do you remember talking about that a few weeks ago? What we're in right now, still, 3 weeks later, is a season that leads to the coming of Christ at Christmas. But liturgically, this is a distinct season. And I'm doing my best. I'm doing my best to be careful about that. I'm really trying. I know that Jesus ain't born till he's born, liturgically speaking. And so I won't tell you Merry Christmas until it's Christmas. Bishop Reed even sends out an email to the clergy a week or so before Advent starts, and he just kind of tells us to switch things up liturgically to emphasize Advent, and he warns us about not getting too Christmassy. And so again, I'm trying. I'm doing my best, but it is hard. And it's hard to not get too Christmassy, not just because I'm ready for it to be Christmas. It's hard because I think our lectionary, which is our set readings for each Sunday, I think our lectionary kind of shoots us in the foot a little bit today. It's kind of hard to keep up that Advent spirit when we've got Matthew telling us, now the birth of Jesus Christ took place in this way, right? Merry Christmas, I guess. I think it came a little early this year. Honestly, I'm not mad about it. I'm thankful to have this take on the Nativity story. I'm thankful to have this perspective. We hear Luke's account every year. Luke has the more famous Christmas story, and so it's nice to give Matthew a little bit of love. It's nice to hear what he has to say. Plus, Matthew's birth story is admittedly mostly interested in the stuff that leads up to the Nativity. And it centers around a main character who I want to talk about in a minute. But the actual birth of Jesus just kind of happens there at the end of our reading today. And everything else in this passage is just a prelude to that. Matthew, unlike Luke, Matthew doesn't give us any real details that are immediate to the nativity story. Luke, on the other hand, he includes all kinds of stuff. He's got, the inn at Bethlehem. He's got the manger scene. He's got the shepherds in the field. We don't have any of that in Matthew. Matthew is interested in some details that are, I guess, a bit further out from that holy night. Now, who is Matthew interested in? If we look at our text today, who is kind of the central character in this story? Obviously, he's interested in Jesus, right? But who is center stage here for Matthew? Who does he want us to think about? Joseph. Matthew wants us to think about Joseph, Jesus' legal father, his stepfather, adoptive father, whatever you want to call him. He wants us to think about Joseph. And I think many of us are probably familiar with Joseph's story. We know this story. We've heard this before. But it's worth kind of hunkering down with him for a minute. It's worth considering Joseph. First of all, because Matthew wants us to. Matthew seems to think that Joseph is important, and we'll talk about that. But it's also worth considering Joseph because we find in him an incredible example of holiness, of mercy, of compassion, and of quiet obedience. Joseph is a remarkable character. He's a remarkable figure in the story of our salvation. And in this season of waiting, and by that I mean more than just these 4 weeks of Advent, I mean this season of waiting that we're in life as we wait for Jesus. In this season of waiting, we would do well to grow more and more into someone like Joseph. Someone who not only believes with a kind of intellectual assent to God's activity in the world, but someone who also acts and obeys and gets in on what God is doing, even if it's hard. Joseph is an image not just of faith, but of faithfulness as a response to the coming of Christ. Let's talk for a minute about why Joseph is important for Matthew. Why is he so critical in Matthew's narrative of the life of Jesus? Aside from his commendable qualities, what's the big deal with Joseph? And if you read the beginning of Matthew's gospel, which is just a big genealogy, you'll see that Joseph's importance in the story it's not ambiguous at all. Joseph is important for Matthew and for all of God's people because he's David's son. Maybe not a first-generation son. He's a great, and so on grandson of David. Joseph comes from the line of David. And as any good Jewish person of the first century would know, the anointed one, God's Messiah, was to come from that line. The Messiah would have that Davidic heritage. And in him, in this Messiah, the Lord would make good on all of his promises to David. So it is a big deal. And it makes sense that when the angel comes to visit Joseph in a dream, what does he say to him? What's the first thing? Joseph, son of David. His Davidic identity is crucial to the story. And at the end of the story, something really significant happens at the end of our story today. I wonder if you caught this. This is something that might not seem very remarkable to us, but Joseph is the one to give the name to Jesus. And the name itself, Jesus, has that Hebraic meaning. It's meaningful in the Hebrew language. It's a name that points to God's saving work and deliverance. But in addition to the theologically loaded name Jesus, we have the giver of the name. The one who gives the name to Jesus is important. A New Testament scholar writes that it is through this act of Joseph that Jesus also becomes son of David. In other words, even though Jesus doesn't have a blood relation with Joseph, the act of naming, it imparts kinship. And so now the stage is set for the Davidic Messiah, the one who would come into the world, the one who would heal us, the one who would save us, the Messiah. And for Matthew, Joseph's lineage, while that is certainly enough to bring him up, that's not the only thing that Matthew wants us to know about Joseph. In addition to his lineage, Matthew wants us to think about Joseph's character. And Joseph could have skipped over this altogether, right? Joseph only had so much space and so much ink and so much expensive paper, but he wants us to know more than just the lineage of this man. He wants us to know the heart of this man, Joseph. And I want to look at this moment when Joseph finds out that Mary is pregnant. Before he knows what's really happening, before he hears from the angel, Joseph's approach is totally colored by mercy and compassion. And this is in response to what anyone would assume to be infidelity, which would be an offense to Joseph personally, not to mention a legal offense. That is a punishable offense. Even though the formal marriage had not happened yet, Mary and Joseph were bound to each other by this thing called betrothal. And betrothal at that time had legal stipulations. There's some crossover with what we think of as engagement, but there's also quite a bit more to it. In fact, we see in Matthew's account that he kind of plays it fast and loose, even with the titles of husband and wife. He kind of throws those terms around even before they're really married. And I think that kind of speaks to the seriousness of the commitment of betrothal. They haven't been brought together in marriage yet. Sexual abstinence is still what's expected of them, but they are legally bound to each other. And infidelity is punishable, even by death. I should say it was punishable by death in the Old Testament. The Romans actually had outlawed that sort of thing. Not that the Romans themselves were opposed to capital punishment. They just didn't want their subjects killing each other outside of their courts. And of course, that's not to say that the people wouldn't just do it anyway, even if it were not legal. But while the death penalty may or may not have been on the table, it would have been in keeping with the law to make Mary's transgression, or apparent transgression, known publicly. That would have been totally in keeping with legal righteousness to make Mary's infidelity known. So with that in mind, let's take a look at what Matthew says. Our translation here says that Joseph, being a just man and unwilling to put her to shame, resolved to divorce her quietly. Here's the question, though. What does just mean here? What does it mean that Joseph is a just man? Wouldn't the fullness of justice require Joseph to go public with Mary's situation? Wouldn't that be what justice looks like? And certainly when Matthew says that Joseph is a just man, he means more than just that he's like a cool guy and he just kind of lets things slide, right? It's something more than that. So actually, I've seen it argued that a better translation or a better understanding of Matthew's gist might be something like this. Joseph, being a just man and yet unwilling to put her to shame, resolved to divorce her quietly. So there's a little bit of tension there. Do you see the difference? What do we make of that? Well, let's take a look at some early interpretation. It's always good to take a look at the church fathers and see what they have to say. I want us to look at what one particular church father says about this. This is a gentleman named John Chrysostom. He's a guy, he died in 407 AD. And FYI, the word Chrysostom there, that's not John's last name. It means, it comes from a Greek word. It means that he is golden-mouthed. He has a golden mouth and he speaks well. He writes well. His words are beautiful. And this is what John the Golden Mouth says about Joseph. This is a beautiful interpretation here. He says, "Thus, whereas to keep her in his house seemed like a transgression of the law, but to expose and bring her to trial would constrain him to deliver her to die. He does none of these things, but conducts himself now by a higher rule than the law." It's an interesting thing to say. Let's explore this a little bit more. I know that there's some antiquated English in here, so bear with me. But John Chrysostom goes on. He says, "For grace having come in Jesus, there must needs henceforth be many tokens of that exalted citizenship. For as the sun, though as yet he show not his beams, does from afar by his light illumine more than half the world, so likewise Christ, when about to rise from that womb, even before he came forth, shone over all the world." Do you get what he's saying there? He's saying that the coming of Christ is like the sunrise. And even though he's not born yet, even though he hasn't come into the world just yet, the beams of his light are starting to light up the world like the sun that's just beyond the horizon. And what Joseph is doing, Joseph's behavior, his mercy, his refusal of hot-headedness and jealousy, is the fruit of that light. And I know I'm mixing metaphors with fruit and light, but you get what I'm saying. I'm not golden-mouthed like John Chrysostom. You get the idea. The light of Christ is so bright that it shines out in certain ways before Christ is even born. And let me just give you just a skosh more of John Chrysostom. He says, "Wherefore, even before her travail," in other words, before Mary gave birth, "prophets danced for joy, and women foretold what was to come. And John, when he had not yet come forth from the belly, leaped from the very womb. Hence also this man, Joseph, exhibited great self-command, in that he neither accused nor upbraided, but only set about putting her away." I think that's beautiful. I love that interpretation. And more than just being beautiful, I think it's right. Joseph was responding to the grace of God, which was bursting into the world. And what that looked like for Joseph was love. And not just easy love, but really hard love. I can't imagine what was going on in Joseph's heart and mind. I mean, think about that. Think about getting the news that your betrothed is now pregnant and it's not yours. I can't imagine what Joseph was wrestling with. I can't imagine what he was trying to grapple with. But what he chose to do was an act of profound mercy. Mercy that points us to an even greater mercy. The mercy of Jesus, Joseph's adopted son, the son of David, the anointed one. And then, of course, when word came down from the top, so to speak, things changed for Joseph immediately. When he got that word from the angel, he immediately changed his course of action. And despite any risk to his own reputation, he took Mary to be his wife, and he took Jesus to be his boy. And my prayer for us this Advent season, this fourth Sunday of Advent, is that we would consider Joseph, and that we would ask the Lord to make us more like him. Give us mercy like Joseph. Give us compassion like Joseph. Make us obedient like Joseph, so that when other people see us, they would see the Son of David. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit.